I had an opportunity this past week to go back to the seminary where I was formed as a priest down in Baltimore. A couple things that were going on down there. One of the professors that was there was a priest, but he was ordained a bishop for the Diocese of Oslo, Norway. So he had a little massive Thanksgiving, and we had a little celebration and reception after that. And then the next day there was a little ceremony for the seminarians, younger seminarians, especially there were two from our diocese in Syracuse that received the rights of lector and acolyte, which means that they are able to now at the seminary proclaim the word and then serve at the Mass. So I took an opportunity to go down there, see some old friends that I went to school with and some of my professors. And when I go back down to the seminary, which is probably like maybe once or twice a year, I always love walking around. I always love to reflect on my time there, the 6 years that I spent in just the goodness of it. And people often ask me, they say, it seems like a long time, the seminary formation, 6 years, maybe 7, up to 10 years. That seems like an awful long time. And I tell them, it does sometimes feel like it's very, very long, but also it goes by in a flash. And there's a reason why it's so the length that it is. There's two reasons specifically. One is that there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of courses to learn between Scripture and moral theology and systematic theology. There's a lot that we need to put into our minds, to kind of sit with and gain. But probably the second thing and the most important thing is that it takes time for a man to be formed into a man of God. It takes time for him to reflect on what he learns, reflect on what God is calling him to, reflect on the teachings of the church in Jesus. It takes time to take a man and build him into a priest, into a man of God. So it takes that time, and especially to get to know the identity of God, to know who He is. And that's the central theme of our first reading today. God's identity. And we hear it loud and clear at the burning bush. This remarkable sight, this what we call theophany, God revealing Himself to His people. So that's the heart of this first reading. And this burning bush, this theophany happens to Moses. And so the last 3 weeks, we've heard from Moses. We've heard about him in these readings. So kind of knowing that, we'll say, well, I guess Moses is pretty important. He has a lot to do with Lent. And you'd be right. Because one of the reasons why is we say he's the precursor to Jesus. He is a precursor of Jesus. Jesus sometimes is given this title, the new Moses, and for good reason, because we can see in Moses' life the life that was to come in Jesus' life. Let's just look at it this way. First, let's start with Moses. Moses was given this great task. He did this. He led the people of Israel out of slavery. Well, this is what Jesus did. Jesus saves the people of the new Israel, not just the Jews, but the whole world, the church, as we say. So Jesus led and saved the new Israel from slavery of sin. So there's a really great correlation there. Moses saves Israel from slavery. Jesus saves the new Israel from slavery to sin. And that's very important because we need to be saved from it. And that brings us to Moses. And Moses is the one who has this great, great calling. And today we hear Moses' superhero origin story, if you will. This is kind of like when Bruce Wayne, when he was orphaned, then he became Batman, or when Peter Parker was bit by the spider and became Spider-Man. Those are the only two I know. So I bet there's somebody out there saying, "Oh, I hope he's going to talk about Green Lantern." I'm like, sorry, I don't know anything about Green Lantern, man. But this is the story. This is the origin of Moses because this is where the story begins. He is a shepherd, like many in the Old Testament, and actually our good shepherd, Jesus. He's a shepherd out mending to his flock, and he sees this great vision, a great sight on the mountain of God. And he goes over to investigate it. And then God speaks to him. He says, "Moses, come no further. Where you're standing is holy ground." And then from there, he takes off his sandals. And then God reveals His identity to Moses and to us. And He does it in two phases. First, He says, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." So what He's doing, He's saying, I am the God who was the God of your ancestors. I am the Jewish God. I am the God going back to the beginning of creation. I was the one who hovered over the waters of the world. I am the same God. But then also He goes a little bit deeper, because then He reveals really His essence in two words. And I think this may be difficult to grasp, because it's two words that we use all the time. Moses says, well, who do I say to the people that you are? And God says, tell him this. Tell him that I am. I am sent you. That's who God is. That's his name, is I am. And it's easy for us to kind of get lost in that because we say that all the time. We say I am statements every day. I am hungry. I am, because I only had a Cliff Bar this morning. But we can go even further. Like, I am running. I am waiting for a bus. It kind of gets lost in that. But really, what God is saying at this moment is he's saying that I am. I've always been. I've been here before the creation of the world. I always will be. I will never have an end. I am. I am existence itself. All being comes through me. That is who Moses sees on the mountain that day, the source of our very being. Very profound. Last week I talked about Thomas Merton, and I talked about his burning bush moment, because at one point, when he was studying at Columbia in the early 1920s, he was atheist. He had an atheistic sense of thinking, and he thought and he assumed the God of the Christian God to just be a mythical figure, like Zeus or Hera or one of the Greek gods, that he had no purpose in our lives. But he encountered the burning bush of Catholic philosophy, and that helped him realize that no, this God is no myth. This God is no figment of our imagination. This is a very real God who is I am, who is the source of our being, who all existence came out of. So that is the important thing too, because when all existence comes out of that means that we are created by him, and that is our creator. But not only that, not only does God reveal his identity to Moses, but he also reveals Moses' identity and purpose to him. Because what happens at the end of this first reading, he says, I need to go and save my people from slavery. I'm going to bring them out of slavery in Egypt, and I'm going to bring them into a land of milk and honey. And at that point, that's God's mission, but also he implies that this is also, Moses, your mission. That your identity is found in my identity, my purpose. My I am is also your I am. Tell them I am sent you. So that's the crux of today. The crux of today's reading is that the only place that we can find our true identity is in God alone. The only place we can find it is in God alone. I realized that in my youth, in my earlier youth. When I was in high school and college, a lot of my friends, we were all kind of focused on what are we going to be when we grow up? What are we going to do when we get out? And there was this great sense that when we go to college, we'll get a degree that'll put us into a great profession that'll help us have our meaning, have our identity. And I realized a few years out of college working that we really don't get our identity from that. I at least didn't. And I think about those titles that I had after college when I went through business school. That eventually I became an auditor. Eventually I became an accountant. But I didn't see my identity in that. But it was through prayer, going to God, that's where I found my identity. Because I actually found my identity more in the title Catholic than I did any of those other professions. And actually, I still truly to this day, that is my identity, Catholic. But even then we can go further than that, because friend of Jesus, that's also our identity too. So kind of summing that all up, we find our identity in God, and the way to connect ourselves to that is simply prayer. Prayer is that thing that allows us to connect ourselves to our God, but also to who we truly are meant to be. Let's just look at Moses for a second. Moses is a man with history. So before this, in Exodus 3, this was the story of the burning bush. But earlier on in Exodus 2, Moses has a moment in his life that could have defined him. Probably he found it defined him very, very strongly. And that is that he encountered an Israelite fighting an Egyptian. And to stop the fight, he went over to help the Israelite, and he ended up killing the Egyptian. And then later became known for that man who killed the Egyptian. So we can imagine that probably hovered over to his head like a black cloud. That probably was what he thought was his identity, this man who killed an Egyptian. But it's this moment where his life changes, because then he meets the Lord, and his identity is not one who killed an Egyptian, but it is one who now is given this sacred purpose to cooperate with God's purpose, to go and to save God's chosen people and bring them out of Egypt. And we can see that because Moses frequently goes to prayer. He goes frequently to prayer. He goes up the mountain. He'll go and commune with God. He'll receive from him. And the great thing about that is if you read through the rest of Exodus, which I encourage you to do, Moses is changed physically in appearance. Every time he goes up, he is before the glory of God. And God's glory is so bright that it reflects onto Moses, and then he reflects that glory like a mirror back onto the people. And in fact, so brightly does Moses reflect that glory that he has to eventually put a veil over his face when he goes down the mountain so as to not blind the Israelites. And that's what happened to Moses, but that's also what could happen to us through prayer. That we, through prayer, can absorb the glory of God, but also reflect that out into the world. That's the power of prayer. And sometimes we have maybe a difficulty with prayer because we're maybe intimidated by it. We may not quite know what prayer is. Because, one thing is we could say, well, it takes a while to pray. I don't want to spend so much time in prayer. Or we may just see prayer as mere recitation. Like, people just pray, they read words, they say prayers that they've known their whole life, that's it. Well, prayer is much deeper than recitation. The rosary, yes, we recite 50 Hail Marys, 5 or so Our Fathers, but that recitation is built at going through the mysteries. We reflect on the mysteries of Christ's life in there. And so that is taking us from that recitation and bringing us deeper into the heart of the Lord. St. John Henry Newman, who is a saint now, I think he has the most simple way of describing prayer. And he does it in a very small Latin phrase. Prayer is cor ad cor loquitur, which translates to heart to heart with God. A heart to heart. So if we turn to prayer, if we view it as this heart speaking to heart, then really maybe we'll be able to grasp prayer and use it so much better. Because when we have that prayer, when we view prayer as a heart to heart, we're not heart to heart with anybody just mundane, but we're having a heart to heart with that very I am, who created the world and created us. So today we celebrate because not only does Moses have a burning bush to go to, but so do we. And our prayer can be that burning bush, that place where we encounter our Lord and we learn His identity. But also, too, the beautiful thing about that is not only will we know God's identity, but slowly but surely, God will reveal our purpose and our identity to us.